Hi, friends. My dog was chewing on my microphone, so my sound is about to be terrible in this video. But our textbook refers to this time period in US history known as Reconstruction. And I think it's an area that is really, really misunderstood in US history. And I think I have a couple of ideas why. But Reconstruction, historians say, happened from about 1865 at the end of the US Civil War to about 1877. There's a couple things going on with it in this video, but I want to keep it really brief because Reconstruction basically means rebuilding. So, what actually happened? Well, first I asked my eighth grade students, like, what happens when you lose? Anything, a sporting event, a contest, whatever. You have a winner, you have a loser, and usually, in this case, it was the North versus the South. The North had won the Civil War, and the South really was frustrated by it. They didn't want to accept defeat. This happens lots of times in history. If you lose, you want to find a reason why you lost, right? Like it can't be your fault. It has to be somebody else. You blame somebody. So I ask my students, what's the first thing they do if they lose a close volleyball or a basketball game? They always say they blame the refs. Well, in this case, you had the South, which had lost the Civil War by 1865. And this quote from Mark Twain actually really captures the idea behind what it meant. In the North, it talks about how the war would be like mentioned, but only briefly. But when you go to the South, the war and the aftermath of the war is impacting everyone. It's constantly what everybody talks about because for over 4 years, this war had literally devastated the South, and they were forced to rejoin the Union, more or less. So there's definitely a incredible divide between the North and the South at the conclusion of the Civil War, at the beginning of, again, Reconstruction. The South was literally devastated, hence the title. Gone with the Wind was an expression. Here's a photograph of Charleston, South Carolina, after we saw Sherman's march to the sea. We have a flyer here showing veterans who had lost their dominant hand how to basically write left-handed. And here's a photograph of a Mississippi War veteran who lost both his legs. The textbook says that over one-fifth of the entire money of Mississippi in 1866 went to artificial limbs and legs and arms for war veterans. So the war obviously impacted the North as well, but the South was where the majority of the war was fought. The text actually says, too, by 1866, interestingly enough, there were more people in the United States than when the war actually started. They talks about influx of migrants from Germany and China and Scandinavia. At one point, there were so many German immigrants that Native Americans end up learning German afterwards, too. But the big point with Reconstruction goes to, again, what happens with the 4 million now freed African American men and women in the South? So I pose a couple of questions. What happens to the 4 million newly freed African Americans? They're free now, but are they going to have the same opportunities as other Southerners? Are they going to have the same chance to learn and to succeed, to learn different jobs and apprentices and learn how to read? Right? What does it mean actually to be free? The 13th Amendment we saw was passed. This abolished slavery, but would it be enforced? Right? Laws can change, but what about hearts and minds? And then finally, what does freedom actually mean, again, to someone who has spent their entire life in bondage, someone who thought forever that they were going to be enslaved? We saw from 1619 until 1865, slavery had just been ingrained in U.S. culture and in U.S. society. So, what does freedom actually mean? We should, again, celebrate the passage of the 13th Amendment, but what actually happened afterwards? Well, the text leaves us with an excerpt which I think is really good. How did it go? Again, it referring to Reconstruction. With a whole lot of confusion. It was the most promising, despairing, noble, awful, idealistic, reactionary, hopeful, and hopeless time in all of American history. And it didn't end up going very well. What happened from 1865 to 1877? And why does our text describe it as not very well? And what are the implications of it? That is what Reconstruction is. It's a part of history that isn't studied as much, but it's definitely something that is worthy of attention now more than ever.